Welcome to SouthCoast Matters. I'm Paul Latendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor, and SouthCoast Matters is a public access television program where we bring together business leaders, civic leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can work in harmony to have a positive impact on our South Coast communities.
And we try to have interesting conversations with some interesting people. And today's interesting person is Carol Doherty. Carol's the former president of the Mass Teachers Association, and
she was also a third grade teacher in New Bedford and Taunton, an elementary school guidance counselor in Taunton, and is currently a member of the Taunton School Committee. She's also a co-host of a Saturday morning radio program called Silver City Meeting House on WVBF Radio.
And what else are we missing, Carol? We do want to, we're nosy. Our two viewers both want to know more about our guest.
Well, you certainly, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to share our common thinking about public education. I'm imagining that's what we're thinking, or anything else that's going to come up. And my resume is relatively lengthy, but that's a pretty good synopsis. Where did you get that?
Paul does his research.
Off your campaign, one of your campaign things from a few years ago. You've also done work at, or associated with Northeastern and Leslie.
Oh, yes, yes.
What are you doing at Leslie?
I started my higher education career at Leslie University, working in the School of Education there, in the Graduate School of Education. And then when the dean, Jim Fraser, moved from Leslie to Northeastern, I followed on about 6 months after we went to Northeastern to the School of Education, and spent 18 years there directing a program called the Professional Development Program. That meant that I had the pleasure and the opportunity to travel across the Commonwealth, meet with teachers and superintendents and others to talk about what their needs were, and to work with folks at Northeastern to create programs primarily uniquely designed to meet the particular need that the district articulated. I had a lot of fun with that.
It sounds like fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun with that. Engaged a lot of practicing teachers as instructors for some of the programs. Obviously used resources at the university to provide program design, and had an opportunity to create brand new programs that were meaningful and important to teachers and students across the
So how'd you get demoted to the third grade from the university level? You're way up there.
Well, actually I started at the third grade, so it's promoted. It's my love for education, the career path that I started out graduating from Boston University, going to New York City and working for an advertising agency there called J. Walter Thompson back in the day, and I won't tell you how far back that was. What they wanted from women primarily in a workplace like that, and it was what was that television program?
Mad Men.
It was that era of advertising. They wanted women for secretaries or clerks of some sort. So I couldn't type.
Coffee runs and light my cigarette for me.
All of that kind of thing. So it really wasn't the kind, and I had a degree in marketing, so I imagined that I would be, and it was right on the cusp of the women's movement back in the day, so that dates me somewhat. So I had great expectation about what I could do in New York City. Stayed there for about 3 years, and then came back to Massachusetts. I lived in Westport at the time, and talked to friends of mine who were teaching, asked how I could do that, and back in the day in the 60s, people with degrees who wanted to teach were few and far between. And so literally district, I started in New Bedford, hired me first and asked questions later. The state, of course, required that I take a certain number of courses to be certified, and so I taught and learned simultaneously at Bridgewater. So that's how I got on the pathway to education.
Okay, now you've given away a few secrets. So you would, that was back in the 60s. You might have preceded hippies. You might have been like a beatnik, because in those cool days, it was cool to be a beatnik before it was cool to be a hippie.
I missed that.
Did you miss it? Okay.
I missed that. I was probably in in that group of women who got hope chests for their weddings and sewing machines, and not...
I would have never guessed that about you.
Well, I could be a hippie now and be comfortable doing that.
You're pretty cool now.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
One thing I have to add, growing up in a corporate world, spending my entire career in corporate America and Canada, I grew up as an anti-union person. I mean, I was a Catholic and a Republican, and that was everything outside of that was evil. Protestant Republicans weren't so bad, they weren't quite evil, but everything outside of that was considered evil. And my dad owned a business. Labor unions were, but we were afraid of them. If a union comes, we're going to starve. And I grew up thinking unions ruin this country. I think there's still a lot of people who think that and still believe that unions were the downfall of America. And I know you were president of the Mass Teachers Union. To me, it's more of a PR, public relations faux pas on a union's part than anything that the unions did. Some unions overreached, I'm sure, and some management overreached. And I don't know, how do you feel on that? Is there an education lesson in that?
Well, I have to say first that the nation forgets that a lot of the advantages that exist in the workplace that are union and non-union shops today are because of the way in which people struggle to form unions and to be able to achieve rights, workers' rights, decent wages, decent working hours, keep children off the factory floor, was because of the union movement back in the day. And so I think that it's important to remember that. Unfortunately, the union movement in the country, both within education and otherwise, is a diminishing resource. It's about 8 or 9% of workplaces across the country are unionized. The teachers maintain a foothold across the country through the National Education Association and the state and local associations as a union shop. I think that it is a misunderstanding that teachers' unions are interested only in wages, hours, and conditions of employment. And that is not the case, or maybe it is the case, and it depends on how you define conditions of employment. Conditions of employment meaning clean workplaces, appropriate and sufficient materials so that we can teach.
Textbooks.
I mean,
computers,
that is, and it affects children directly. When I first ran for school committee, I mean, obviously I'm very proud of my tenure as president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association. We did a lot of good work during those years, and the union, of course, still continues to do that. The occasional person whose door I might knock at would say, oh, well, you know, you're a union person. You're going to give away the store to the teachers. And my response to that is, listen, if giving away the store to the teachers means that we agree on something that is in the best interest of our children, then we're going to agree, and that's the pathway that we'll follow. If we don't agree, then we're going to negotiate or mediate or collaborate around issues that are important to the well-being and achievement of our children. Teachers are at the table, not just the bargaining table, but they are included in Taunton in the conversations that affect our children. There were 2 or 3 years of conversation that went on to achieve what we call inclusion in our schools, where our special needs children, to the extent that that's possible, are included in the regular education mainstream and in the regular classes. Teachers work side by side with school committee and other school staff to create a good inclusion model. We have another structure called professional learning communities, where teachers come together regularly in teams across a grade in a school to collaborate around, so they have conversations about children's needs. They collaborate around what needs to be done that's in the best interest of particular children and their whole classes in order to advance the curriculum that's so important. So there's a lot of collaboration. I mean, the finger's always pointed at the union, whether it's education or otherwise. Oh, it's the union's fault. We can't get anything done.
I agree,
the
finger's always pointed at the union. And my own experience, when I finally did move up to senior management and was transferred to different companies that had unions I was overseeing 4 companies, and at one time there were 2 union and 2 non-union houses. And to this day, I can't remember which ones are which. The unions helped me when I was in senior management. If I had a problem with a worker, and there was a worker who was hurting our company, all I had to do was bring in the union boss, tell him about it, and the problem was gone. I think teachers have the reputation, though, of protecting that teacher who doesn't care anymore, just collecting the paycheck. And
Well,
that's the perception.
well, interestingly enough, the law requires that the union, we have dues-paying members, they pay their dues for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is to protect them in a difficult situation. The law requires that the union provide support, legal or otherwise, to that teacher who may be under the gun for whatever reason. So there is no choice about representing the interests of teachers. Very often, perhaps not here in Taunton, but otherwise in my experience as president of the MTA, there's always an effort when a teacher is not meeting the needs that are, or the expectation of a quality teacher. There are conversations that go on about how the individual who might be under the gun, if you will, can manage that, how the district can manage it. What is it that the district is responsible for in terms of improving that teacher's performance? What is that individual responsible for? And perhaps some agreements to move people along. So it's not, and tenure doesn't, again, tenure doesn't protect teachers in that respect. What it does protect teachers is from arbitrary and capricious firing, which went on all the time, less so now because there are some fail-safes for workers, just workers anywhere. We know that in non-union shops, people talk about not getting their fair wage, having their, especially hourly employees, having their hours changed from day to day, and not getting overtime pay. We hear those stories all the time. The union is there to prevent that, or try to prevent that from happening, or at least negotiate what the next step ought to be. So we need to look at the teachers union, we meaning a society needs to look at teachers and the teachers union as the best friend of children and the greatest advocate of children, because that really is our first responsibility.
You know, Paul, I want to say something about when you talk about the teachers union gets a bad rap for protecting bad teachers. Well, you can't always say that. The school management bears some responsibility in providing progressive discipline and making sure that the resources are available to make sure this teacher can be the best teacher possible. So I think it's kind of a cop-out to blame it all on the teachers union all the time. That's just my 2 cents on that. It really is irritating that management doesn't take any responsibility.
And that's a perception, and to me, just the fact that perception's out there means that the teachers' union's done a poor job of public relations. All unions have done a poor job of public relations.
It's just easy to bash unions, though,
Sure
too.
it is. Sure it is.
Well, and I think to the point that you're raising, I'd always say that management hires the individual. Management's responsibility is to evaluate that individual and to provide resources and support for improvement, moving that individual along in positive ways, and to step in when good things weren't happening. And I think that not in many cases, teachers were not, and not necessarily here in Taunton, but otherwise teachers were not evaluated on a regular basis. They were evaluated now and then. If teachers, so a non-tenure person might be evaluated in the first 3 years after that, irregularly, depending on the will and the whim of the leadership of a particular school district. With the new teacher evaluation system, it's a much more rigorous, hands-on kind of evaluation system where teachers set their own goals, they're measured against those goals. Principals and other supervisors are trained to know what to look for and to evaluate on a regular basis.
Are those evaluations universal?
Well, in Massachusetts, they're universal. Okay. And under the No Child Left Behind law, which is called Every Student Succeeds Now, which recently enacted legislation on the federal level, required of all states a new a look at the evaluation system that existed and the creation of a new one in Massachusetts. And it's still a work in progress, but it's very rigorous and very hands-on. And teachers are stepping up to the plate and using the creation of mutual goals, so that those professional learning communities that I talked about earlier create the environment where there's a lot of collaboration and conversation among teachers, and so there is an opportunity to create mutual goals for children. And teachers look at their evaluations and review that and share with their peers ways in which they can improve their own practice. And so it's a much better system that is not just somebody coming in, standing at the door and looking at a class that could be disruptive, or the teacher may be having a bad day and turning around, giving that person a bad evaluation and walking away. It's really hands-on.
Good, good.
So part of being able to do your job properly is to have the resources needed to provide the curriculum that people have agreed on is important to the children. Now, the state just had a commission that found out that they were underfunding education in a variety of areas. What is it, 500 million or so that it was
Something
short?
significant.
And so it's tough enough now with property taxes and trying to fund local education budgets. Now the state's facing a shortfall. We could be looking at cuts in Chapter 70, which is the state portion of local aid funding for education. So how do you advocate to make sure you have enough resources? How do you spread those thin resources enough that you can get the job done?
Well, I have to say first that Taunton has one of the lowest per pupil expenditures among urban districts across the Commonwealth. So we spend about $11,800 per child, which is very low. Cambridge spends about $26,000 per child, and they have fewer children. And I just learned that Cambridge has fewer pupils than Taunton does, about 6,700 compared to about 8,500. It's interesting, as an aside there. So we have great expectations in terms of first of all, what we need to do, and being able to establish new programs going forward. So we are very resourceful. Superintendent and her team are very resourceful in identifying other places for money. So we developed a half dozen years ago. We're a comprehensive high school, so we have vocational programs. The state portion of the per pupil expenditure for vocational programs is somewhat higher than it is for regular education. So when we have 600 or 700 children participating in those programs, so that helps to grow the budget. We are always on the lookout for grants and other resources that are going to help to support the funding that we need in order to provide the appropriate full education. So
will the average grant come in with a quid pro quo? We'll give you this money if you do this. And
well, they always.
Are you compromising the quality of the education at that point?
Well, the Department of Education at both the state and federal level have very high expectations, so I don't believe at all. And we wouldn't apply for a grant that was asking us to diminish our expectation at all. Problem with grants is, and certainly it helps to support the things that we need to do, but there's always the sustainability question when you write a proposal. How are you going to carry on after the 3 or 5 years of funding is gone away? So we recently, for example, had a grant that allowed us to grow our pupil support programs, i.e. more guidance counselors. That grant expired, and the city, with its supplemental budget, has recently provided the resources to continue to hire those guidance counselors. But that's the trick. A lot of, I think of resources that are available, are very small resources available from the state for pre-K programs of 4-year-olds, which is a big push across the nation. All of the research suggests that the earlier a child is provided in education, a formal education, the better they're going to do as they go along. So I made a motion as a member of the school board to have us look at creating a pre-K, a free pre-K program in the public schools. Well, the state provided resources a year ago, but it was a competitive grant process. And the money went to 6 different districts, certainly districts in need: Boston, Lawrence, New Bedford, I believe. I can't recall the other 3, but we didn't apply for the money at the time. But it has to be a commitment by the legislature to a program like that, and to provide the resources, not in a competitive way, but money that you can actually depend on, where you can move forward with that kind of program. So.
I would think especially for cities like gateway cities, Taunton, New Bedford, Fall River, where they might have a higher percentage of immigrant children or English language learners, or just kids coming out of really poor households where they may not get read to, and where they may not get those opportunities for those little jump starts in their early learning, so they come to kindergarten prepared to learn. So it only makes sense to me as an investment that will pay off way more than we invest in the end, is to provide programs like that for cities. I mean, I'm not sure it's as big a deal in some of the communities, especially not, like Wellesley or some of the other more wealthy communities we were talking about earlier before we started taping the program. But I just think people lose sight of these investments and what the payoff is in the end.
Let me butt in, Julie, to basically shore up your argument. Fall River, New Bedford, Taunton, the base communities of the South Coast, about the lowest average income per capita in the state. Those cities tend to have larger families and families with greater needs, non-English speaking families, immigrant children, whose I imagine cost more to educate someone who doesn't speak English coming out of their home than it does to educate the average English speaking. So you have greater needs, more students, and less income. How do you make that work and treat these children as equals?
Well, we do treat these children as equal, and our special. So we have at-risk children who may not be special education children, or in our English language learners population, and so those 3 populations do cost more money to educate. Our per pupil cost is more because you need more resources. You need more family supports, more guidance counselors, more adjustment counselors, and that kind of what we call surround services to help to support those families and children so that they can have their education adequately addressed. So it does cost more. We have to beef up our surround services and those kinds of ancillary personnel in order to support those families. We just recently hired a new special education director, a woman Judy Mulrooney, I can say that, who has worked in Taunton for 26 years. She's an excellent candidate. And I learned more from that interview about our special education program, or some things that I didn't know before. And one of the things that really drove home a point to me about cost per pupil in terms of special education and other at-risk children, and that is that the special education child from 26 years ago, and she says 26 years because of course that's when she started to work, and the special education child that we're dealing with now is very different. There are medical costs. There are more children who come from single-parent homes. There's a lot more homelessness than existed previously, and we embrace all of these children and try to address their particular needs. We keep more of our children who may have disabilities in the public education setting rather than sending them out to a special school, and so all of that costs money, and we're doing that. I mean, we get additional resources from the state for special education children, but the state is not fully funding everything that they've promised to fully fund, so it's very difficult.
Does your $11,000 per student, does that include the extra funding, or is that just out of Taunton?
No, it includes all of the expenses that we incur for educating all of our children, and so that's the difference. So grant money, vocational money, special education money, all of that, transportation money that comes in. This McKinney-Vento law requires districts to transport children who are homeless. So you might have a child that family has taken up residence in Somerset. They don't want to break the education cycle for the child. It's difficult enough as it is, so we are required to transport that child. The state promises 100% funding, but the funds have diminished over the years, but that makes up some of the difference too. So we have to appropriate the funds, but we get these additional funds that help to support those programs.
I don't know that the average taxpayer realizes how complicated the school budget, the school funding formulas, and all these things that are required to go into that. I don't think they understand how complicated that is. And it just isn't a simple, let's, pay a teacher this much, and we got a principal for this, and we got to buy some books, and that's it. There's all these other things that you have to provide for. English language learners, they need to have some way to learn in their own native language to bridge the gap. Like you talked about the McKinney-Vento with the homeless students, and just all the other extra services that are required that weren't when we were more of a village kind of thing than we are today.
And we have a program for our 18 to 21-year-olds as well, who have been students in the special needs population who are now able to stay in Taunton until they're 21. I mean, it's always a problem for parents, a worry for parents when their children graduate from high school, particularly special needs children, about where they're going to go and what they're going to do and how they're going to continue their education or be trained in skill to get into the workforce if they can do that. And so we have a program that keeps those youngsters until they're 21. So it's not like your grandma's education anymore. It's a
No,
you've got a big plate to fill with not a lot of fish to fill it with.
It's such an important job, because how they help mold these students is what we get as citizens coming out of the school, and we're just asking them to do a whole lot with not a lot of resources.
You're absolutely right. The community, rightly so, has very high expectations about what can be achieved in the school, and you add to their academic education, surround services, other kinds of things that we are expected to provide, and gladly so. School breakfast, for example, obviously lunches that we provide, after-school programs that are provided for students. So there's a lot, you're absolutely right, there's a lot more to it than getting on the bus, stepping into the schoolhouse, getting back on the bus, and being driven home. It's very complicated. What occurs during that school day is multifaceted.
And the food programs and the after-school surround care type programs are not funded through the school budget, correct? Those are funded separately.
They're funded separately. They're funded by additional resources.
Yeah.
Well, how'd you know that?
Well, I have experience with school budgets, and I just kind of have self-taught myself a lot of things because I find this such a fascinating, frustrating issue. And I've evolved a long ways.
Good. So have I.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. We have about 1 minute left. I want to thank you for coming. I hope to get you again for a follow-up show, and we hope to do that follow-up show immediately. So we can, won't be shown back to back, but it will be shown in different communities around the South Coast. So.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the time with you both.
Thank you, Carol.
And I've learned so much, and hopefully both of our viewers have learned a little bit too.
I hope so.
Okay, so look for us on Facebook at SouthCoast Matters, and you can also send us comments or questions or anything to southcoastmatters@gmail.com.
And thank you for coming to South Coast Matters. Come again.